So, today we are going to be talking about sin. So, chapters 5 and 6 in your Baltimore Catechism 2. And I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about Adam and Eve first, because we're going to, the whole notion of sin starts with Adam and Eve. Now, when we talk about creation, the Catholic Church has always taught that God created the world out of nothing. He created it in a certain time frame, and then He created the first human beings. We call them Adam and Eve. And that is our story. And the moral and religious underpinnings of our faith rely on Adam and Eve, because we go back to this primordial choice that they made that now afflicts the whole human race. Now, if I had an evolutionary biologist here, the evolutionary biologist would say, no, there was really no Adam and Eve. You know, we had a period where we evolved from one state into another one, and then at some point human beings began to use tools and form societies, and it was a very gradual process over 1 million years. Now, here's the thing. If the one, and I'm not going to say which one, if the one is right and the other is wrong, how does it really change your life today? Does it amount to a hill of beans in anyone's life? No. What if we go with the evolutionary book? So say we take Darwin as our new Bible, because they do that in communist countries. So they take Darwin and teach Darwin to everybody. That thereby proves there is no God. What does that do for human society? Does it somehow magically make a better society? No. What we find in communist type countries or atheistic societies, the people don't tend to have a lot of hope. Their way of life isn't particularly any better. They don't have a reason to do the things they do other than force one another to choose good things, or what they think is true. Now, if you take it from the standpoint of Adam and Eve being real, or any other of the early stories, the story of Noah, or the story of Cain and Abel, knowing those stories, does that change your life?
Yes.
How do those stories change your life?
Gives you something good to look at.
So it presents you with the truth, something good that you can now base your moral choices on. Right? What else?
It explains the reason why there's evil in the world, or there's why the fall explains everything.
Right. So a Darwinistic or atheistic view of the world would say there is no such thing as good and evil, just random things happen. But most people in their lives look at the world and say, no, I believe there is good and I believe there is evil. It's helpful to have an idea of where that comes from, right? What about relationships? You know, does a Darwinian or atheistic view really tell you much about your relationship other than, you know, this person I live with is mutually beneficial, our relationship is mutually beneficial. But when it stops being that way, we can just part ways. You know, that's a kind of very animalistic or simplistic view of human nature. But if you take it from the moral standpoint of Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and his family, what does that tell you about your life?
There's responsibility.
Right. Responsibility, consequences for actions, an ability, it teaches how to plan for the future and make sacrifices so that tomorrow is better than today. And it lets us rise above the animals. So there's a bird, where's that at? Out there on the downspout next to the confessional. It's come back for the last few years and builds the exact same nest. Okay, after 3 years, he didn't start building a skyscraper, did he?
No.
And all of his and her kids, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl bird, When they come back here in 1,000 years, they're still gonna be building the same nest. What's a human being going to be building at that time? Who knows what, you know? Maybe something completely amazing. So because human beings have been able to rise above that animalistic understanding of the world, we don't have to live by instinct. We don't have to live by accident. We don't have to live by the whims of nature. We now subdue, dominate, control our environment, and now we're able to rise up and begin doing human things. So that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. It's about these people that God created that were more than the animals. All right? Is everybody in agreement with that statement? Okay. All right, so we're in the 5th lesson, and if you're in your tan edition, it's on page 17. Marcia, do you need a book?
I can't find mine.
You can have my teacher's edition.
Okay.
and see if I go wrong.
All right, thank you. I'll let you know.
I know, so anybody out there in YouTube land, if you're considering getting the volume 4, I would recommend it. The explanations for the questions are wonderful. Okay, so we do have quite a few definitions here. I'm not going to go through many of these because I have to cook dinner for Mom in about 40 minutes. So, but we have to understand things like corrupted or corruption. Corruption is something that is spoiled or weakened. So we'll refer to the human nature as in that fashion as it is corrupted. It's not destroyed, but it is different than it was. We also might look at this idea of inherit, to come into possession of through our parents or by a will. So what your parents possessed, you possess. We talk about our nature. Later on in the book, we're going to be talking about Jesus' nature. But when we talk about our nature, we understand that in us by which we can know what is right and choose what is good. And a human nature is able to do that. A dog or a cat can only do that in a very basic way. It won't do something if it gets hurt. It won't do it again. If something gives pleasure, it will do it again. And they don't see the long-term consequence for actions, only the immediate. But we can choose what is right and good. And finally, the punishment. A punishment is suffering. And we see this will be sent on Adam and Eve by God because of their sin. Okay, so as we said in the introduction, who were the first man and woman? The first man and woman were Adam and Eve. But do remember, the Bible is not a historical book, and language was different in those days. So if you get too bogged down in the historical details of the story, you're going to miss the bigger picture. So let's stay focused on what's important here. Now, were Adam and Eve innocent and holy when they came from the hand of God? Yes, Adam and Eve were innocent and holy when they came from the hand of God. So, innocent means that you are free from any corruption or sin, and holy means you are like God. So we would see them a bit like we saw the angels last week, that they are created in God's image and likeness, and that's the way that we're supposed to be. So ultimately, what the church is trying to do is restore us to that original state. The church wants to give you the skills you need to be innocent and the prayer to make you holy. So we're trying to get back to that original state before the fall. Now God did give them a command in question 41. To try their obedience, God commanded Adam and Eve not to eat of a certain fruit which grew in the Garden of Paradise. Now that seems very simple, but it's actually very challenging. Because one of the main problems people tend to have with religion is this idea that God is always testing them. And they don't feel like a good and loving God would ever test anybody. He would just give them what they need every day without the trial. What do you all think about that? Have you ever been tested, tried, or tempted? And what comes from God and what comes from the evil one?
Well, not even just God and the evil one, just with your parents. I mean, as you're going up and you're growing up, to be elevated, I was the oldest of six, and to be proven to do better things, I had to accomplish. My room I had to accomplish, in school I had to accomplish taking care of my brothers and sisters.
So as a child, the parents actually stand in the place of God in many ways.
Yeah.
So they will try you and test you and those to get you to become a better person.
Well, like, don't run into the street, or don't touch the hot stove.
Right.
It's for your good.
But many children will try those things out anyway.
Exactly,
Yeah. And we see this in Adam and Eve.
yes.
What about being like a test of faith, where somebody might go for some years or some time where they feel like their prayers are not answered and God isn't listening? Anyone ever experienced anything like that? That desert time?
Yeah.
Is that God trying us or testing us?
No, that's Satan trying to say, God doesn't care, go, don't believe all that stuff because it's not true, look at how you're feeling, because, we know that Satan's the father of lies, and he fans the flames, he wants to discourage us, to divide us, to do all bad things to us. And he wants to make it easy, like, like Eve, oh, God doesn't care, oh, you won't die, Satan always wants the easy way for us.
Right. So as soon as God, if we get into that desert experience where we don't have that automatic comfort we had when we were a child, because like if you're a little kid and you skin your knee and you start hollering, mom just runs and she gets you. When you get older, she might shout from the kitchen and say, just walk it off, right? And so as we get older and we get more mature in our faith, there will be those opportunities to be tested and tried. But yeah, the devil will see that often as an opportunity to come in, because he doesn't get you when you're strong, he gets you when you're weak. When you're having some more difficult times, that's when he's going to be coming after you the hardest.
And one thing I thought was interesting is he always comes as a spirit, like an angel, because he is an angel.
Right. So the devil knows a lot more about God and salvation than you do.
Yeah.
Which were the chief blessings intended for Adam and Eve had they remained faithful to God? Well, it's nice. The chief blessings intended for them, had they remained faithful to God, were a constant state of happiness in this life and everlasting glory in the next. So this constant state of happiness would be pretty amazing. But it's like the change of the seasons. Do you only appreciate your happiness because you've known what it was like to be sad? Or would you be happy to be happy all the time?
I don't think you know what happiness is if you stay happy all the time.
Right. I think it's funny because we're trying to create a society that does that. With our addiction to entertainment and being kept busy, it's trying to kind of enforce this constant state of happiness, where you get a little buzz from your phone, where you get some accolades from your friends, or people like what you say, those sorts of things, and it's exhausting. It really is.
Okay, I have a silly question. Okay, where's the blur, or where is the division here? Constant state of because this is the intention, okay? There is no fall, this was God's original intent. The constant state of happiness in this life and everlasting glory in the next. Okay, we know now, since the fall, there is a next life. This life is curtains, we're done, we died, and all that. So what's this life, next life, in context of the beginning?
Yeah, I have to go a little bit beyond the book here to get into that, but it begs the question of what would God have done if Adam and Eve had never fallen? Would he have then, because they say they were tried and they proved themselves worthy, they did not eat of the fruit, would God then introduce death into the world, but make it more like what we see the Virgin Mary experience? Because what happens at the time of Mary's death? She does not die, but instead she is assumed into heaven. So we get this idea that at the end of their normal lifespan of life, God could then take them into the heavenly realm. In the book of Genesis, we see where the ages of the people begin to decrease. Some of them have these exceedingly long lifespans, and they get lower and lower and lower. As God draws further away from Adam and Eve, the lifespan eventually gets down to the point where it's what we understand today. 50 years or 70 for those who are strong, okay, that sort of thing. So that would have been, that's the plan we never got to see.
Okay.
Until we see the Virgin Mary. We get a little glimpse of it.
And Mary suffered.
And Mary did suffer, that is correct.
Didn't Isaiah get taken up to heaven too? Wasn't it?
Yeah, we see some examples of that, like Isaiah gets in the fiery chariot. Elijah.
Enoch too, I think.
Enoch was one, yeah. What was your question? Did the Virgin Mary suffer?
I said she
did.
She did, at the foot of the cross.
Even though she was without sin, she suffered.
Because she didn't have a constant state of happiness,
That's true.
so, unfortunately.
So did they remain faithful to God? Well, no. Adam and Eve did not remain faithful to God, but broke his command by eating the forbidden fruit. And then what befell Adam and Eve on account of their sin? Well, Adam and Eve, on account of their sin, lost innocence and holiness and were doomed to sickness and death. So if you're teaching the early grades of catechism class, you get into first grade through even fourth grade, it bears repeating that story. At some point in the class, talk about their first parents. Talk about why we do the things we do. When children, because at that age, children are trying to discern how to know right from wrong. And how does God fit into my life? It thoroughly explains the problem of evil. If you go even further into Cain and Abel, it talks about that in even deeper terms. And these stories are very short. You've got one chapter in the Bible for Adam and Eve, a chapter and a half maybe, and then just a little paragraph for Cain and Abel. And the story of Noah is not that long. So those sorts of things help the children understand it. These are ancient stories. They've been used by parents to teach children morality for almost our whole existence as people. So they did not remain faithful. They broke his command. They ate the forbidden fruit. We commonly call it an apple, but the ancient peoples thought it might have been a pomegranate, because the pomegranate was, you'll see that in a lot of old Christian iconography, because it was such a rich fruit. A lot of seeds, though. It's not my favorite. So they lost innocence and holiness and are now doomed to sickness and death. And question 45. On account of the disobedience of our first parents, we all share in their sin and punishment, as we should have shared in their happiness if they had remained faithful. So we see this with I think a story I shared the other day with a father who squanders all his money, and his kids, they don't get the inheritance. It's not their fault. Their father did something bad, but they suffer because of what their father did. And likewise, we see sin often becoming generational in families. If there's a pattern of abuse, it tends to continue from generation to generation, or any number of other ills. 46. What other effects followed from the sin of our first parents? Our nature was corrupted by the sin of our first parents, which darkened our understanding, weakened our will, and left in us a strong inclination to evil. So this is the problem of evil and there are different ways of looking at this in Protestant or Catholic theology. So Catholic theology tends to believe that the human person was created to be good, and it is a wonderful thing, but it has been darkened and corrupted by sin. So the outside begins to look a little worse. In Protestant circles, you might hear them talk about how the human person is completely corrupt and has been redeemed by Christ's grace. And so at baptism, you're kind of covered in this film of grace that makes you look presentable. So it's a bit of the opposite understanding. But we believe as Catholics we were created to be good. Now, the original sin is what calls us to, look at things we shouldn't look at, listen to things we shouldn't listen to, be curious about things we have no business being curious about, doing things that are greedy or selfish or otherwise wrong. because we have this survival instinct, because we fear death, right? If you fear death, you're going to try to protect yourself and your things and try to amass more, and there's this protection mentality. But if you were in the state of Adam and Eve, you would not fear death. So you wouldn't worry about who got the promotion instead of you. You wouldn't worry about having enough money. You wouldn't worry about having, the objects that make you happy, because you're only concerned about the happiness of heaven. But because we can't see that, we can't feel that, we don't understand it, we fear death, now we have all these other sins that accompany that.
What did Protestants believe that we didn't believe?
I'm not going to say all Protestants, I'm just saying you might hear this among some Protestant circles, that you are corrupt and evil on the inside. As one of the reformers said, you're just a big mound of dung, but you're covered in the snow of God's grace. Right? So, but as Catholics, we don't believe that. We believe that you're inside, you're good. You're just marred by the effects of sin on the outside. It's kind of like a typical church. Think about St. Alphonsus. Is it prettier on the inside or the outside?
The inside.
The inside. So the church is a model of the human soul. So even the cathedral, which looks so nice and tall and wonderful, nicer on the inside.
Especially with the windows and the stories.
And you see the windows from the inside, and that's God's grace coming through to tell the story. If you stand outside these churches, it's really hard to figure out what the windows mean.
Windows.
As soon as you go inside, they become glorious, right? What do we call this sin? Question 47. This is called original sin. Why is it called original? This sin is called original because it comes down to us from our first parents, and we are brought into this world with its guilt on our soul. So we are all conceived in sin, unfortunately. It's just part of the human nature until you're baptized. So this is why the ancient church determined it was important to be baptized, because you needed to get rid of original sin. Original sin is there from the very beginning. Now, a child might not be able to choose actual sin until they're 7 or 8 years old, but we don't wait those 7 years for the child to labor under the effects of original sin without any help. So we want to, and in the more ancient rite of baptism, there was a very profound exorcism that you would do over the child, because they believe that at birth you're born into this world of sin where the devil's in charge. And so at the door of church you greet the parents, they ask for the child to be baptized, and then the priest would actually take the corner of his stole and put it over the kid's head as protection as you then walked into the church together to get baptized. And then you exorcise the kid and actually put a little bit of salt on their tongue, and they start going pip, pip, pip. And it kind of gives that idea of spitting out sin. And it's their first taste of blessed food, because it's blessed salt, and you bless it, and then as you go through that process, little by little you draw the kid out of the world into the font, and then give him back to his parents. And so that ritual of baptism, even in the current edition, speaks that truth, that the child is different now. They've been redeemed. Does the corruption of our nature remain in us after original sin is forgiven? Unfortunately, yes. This corruption of our nature and other punishments remain in us after original sin is forgiven. But now you have the ability to fight against it. That's what the baptism does. It gives you the grace you need to be holy. And finally, question 50, was anyone ever preserved from original sin? Well, it would have been Adam and Eve before the fall, but the Blessed Virgin Mary herself, through the merits of her divine Son, was preserved free from the guilt of original sin, and this privilege is called her Immaculate Conception. Did anyone go home and watch the Song of Bernadette last week? No, I didn't. We find it. That's the central core of her visitation, is the Immaculate Conception.
Can I ask a question?
Well, hold on. because when she tells the priest that, the priest says, "What did you say?"
Yeah,
It's how
It's
much
interesting.
you've ever known.
I've seen it before.
What did you say? Go ahead.
For the baptism, how come we don't do the exorcism no more after we said regular baptism?
We do have the exorcism, it's just shorter.
What part is it when you say it? Just curious.
It's at the beginning, I'd have to show you in the book, but it's when you ask the child their name and you get ready to do the anointing of on the chest, it's right before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did witness one of the other ones, okay. The
Yeah.
last-
It's a lot more explicit.
Yes, it was good.
What about John the Baptist? You hear the story about when Mary goes to Elizabeth, and then supposedly when he hears it, he leaves, and then he's supposed to...
That is a pious tradition, that John the Baptist was freed of virginal sin in the womb at the greeting of Mary and Elizabeth. That's a little beyond the scope of our study here, but that is a pious belief. Okay, lesson 6, now we get into sin in a more practical way. So let's get into the questions themselves. It is, I suppose, good enough to mention venial and mortal sin, but they are here. So we'll just go through the definition. Original sin is not the only kind of sin. There's another kind of sin which we commit ourselves called actual sin. So I see this jar of are they pickled beets? Pickled beets sitting on the counter at Wojtowic's house, and I decided to just take that home. So in my voluminous robes, I put that in there, say, "Thanks for dinner, it was great," and I've now committed a sin. I've taken it. Now if he wants to give me pickled beets, I'll happily take them, but if they're stolen, that is now a sin. It's something that I've chosen, I've done it of my own free will, and it was in fact wrong. You don't sin by accident. It's a choice. Actual sin is any willful thought, word, deed, or omission contrary to the law of God. So it can be a thought, word, deed, or omission. So if I think about, like a coveting, right? So I'm jealous. I want someone's wife, or I want someone's belongings. That's a thought. I don't ever act on it, but I think about it, and it gets stuck in there. And I kind of maybe even work out a little plan. That's when you've gone into sin. But if I think about it in terms of, I'd really like to have that car, and it stops there, that's not a sin. I could get that car, but I stole his keys, right? Now you've gone into a sin, you need to get it confessed. A word. This could be an insult, a curse, foul language, telling a lie. Those are all word-based sins. A deed. I don't say anything, but I walk up and I attack someone. I actually go through and take something that doesn't belong to me. I do something that causes another person to fall into sin. I convince them to come with me on my bank robbery. Okay? All those are now deeds. Or omission. I'm at the store, the little old lady is clearly lost. She can't find the hot dog buns, and she's crying because she can't, check the last thing off her list, and I just walk on by because I want to go get my ice cream. Probably a sin of omission. You should have stopped and said, "Ma'am, can I help you?" No, that's very easily done. So those sins of omission are all around us, but it's got to be something that you choose to do. I know that lady needs help, not going to do it, keep moving, you've committed a sin of omission. Now, luckily, there are only two kinds of sins. They're easy to memorize, mortal and venial. Now, a mortal sin is a grievous offense against the law of God. And question 55 tells us, the sin is called mortal because it deprives us of spiritual life, which is a sanctifying grace and brings everlasting death and damnation on the soul. Now, it has to be something that is grave, it has to be grave matter. Grave matter are those things that are found in the Ten Commandments. So things like keeping the Sabbath holy, don't take the Lord's name in vain, no adultery, honor your father and mother. All those things are possible for mortal sin. Now, if you miss Sunday Mass because you were sick, that's not a mortal sin. We'll see that there are extenuating circumstances to get away from that. Or if there was an ice storm the night before, I'll still have people come in the next day and say, oh, Father, I couldn't make it to Sunday Mass. I had a mortal sin. I got to confess it. I let them confess it, but then I remind them, in the future, you don't have to consider this a mortal sin. If you could not physically get here, God does not bind you to the impossible. You're never bound to the impossible. But if you could go, you should go. Now, this sin is called mortal because it deprives us of spiritual life. So mortal sin means you've turned your back on God. You no longer want His graces. So you've chosen to shut off that stream of divine grace by your actions. You basically say, Lord God, I do not want you in my life. So don't do that. That sanctifying grace is what we need to avoid death and damnation. So everlasting death means that you go down to the pit below, and you're miserable with the devil and his angels for the rest of eternity. You don't get to be part of God's life because you've said, I don't want that. And sin is a reflection of free will, because you have to have free will. And God made you that way so that you didn't have to choose Him, or He wouldn't force you to choose Him. Because He could come down and send His angels to put their hands on your shoulders and just put you in the place where you need to be and whisper in your ear and tell you, this is what you have to do now. That would be a kind of a life. You have to freely choose these things. And if we choose to abandon God, He respects that as well. Sadly, but He wants you back, but He will do that. So this is interesting because the mortal sin, the punishment could automatically be death. Anytime you have a mortal sin, God would be well within His rights to remove your life, right? So life is part of that sanctifying grace. He could remove that. He doesn't, but He doesn't. He gives you more chances to come back. Another day to go to confession, another week to get back to Mass, another time to do this. Sometimes then He'll send you someone to maybe even scare you back on the right path. Have you ever heard the story about how St. Anthony became the patron of lost objects? It's an interesting story. St. Anthony of Padua was known for being a very gifted preacher, and in his monastery there were these very beautiful illuminated manuscripts where the monks would sit and they would draw out the letters and put paintings in the manuscripts, translations of the Bible and that sort of thing. And Anthony was very good at this as well. But there was one young brother who did not want to stay at the monastery. He didn't like it. He thought that he wanted to go back to town and be famous or rich or whatever. So he determined one night that he would steal one of these illuminated manuscripts and take it to the city and sell it, make a bunch of money, and then live high on the hog. So he steals the book and heads for the hills. The next morning it's all discovered. And they say, oh, brother so-and-so has left us. He's taken this manuscript. We've got to get the manuscript back because it's so valuable. St. Anthony says, well, the book is fine. I'd rather have a young man come back and be true to his vows, because by his vows, he's going to find his way to heaven. So he prays and prays and prays. The young man, meanwhile, is running through hill and dale, and vale and fountain, and then he comes to this stream. And he's not quite sure how he's going to get across it, but all of a sudden, this enormous, terrible, frightening monster rises up out of the water and scares him to death. He runs right around, straight back to the monastery, gives the book back, does his confession, returns to his life as a monk. Now, we could use that in terms of if we see something scary, hard, or difficult in our lives, that could be God, letting one of those devils loose to say, well, go scare him a little bit, maybe he'll come back. So, sometimes that's what happens. Or you've got a little bit of a difficulty, and that means God is taking this step back and saying, come back to me, come back to me. And get the graces you need to get to the next step in your life.
Oh, Mike?
And the people that come to me because I do work with some of the deliverance ministry, one of the first questions I ask is, okay, so you feel as though your house is haunted or the devil's after you. What's going on in your spiritual life? What's going on in your faith life? Well, I don't go to church. My marriage isn't in the best place. I've got this addiction I'm working on. I never pray, and on and on and on with all these things. And I say, but the devil's been after you. You've been scaring you at night? Oh yeah. Your house is haunted? Oh yeah. And I say, okay. So since this started, are you praying more or praying less? And what do they say?
Less.
No, Father, I pray all the time now. And it gets them into this spiritual state, and then once they work on their marriage and work on going to church and work on their kids and work on their job and their addictions, all of a sudden everything starts to lighten up again. Not always, Marcia.
Yeah, right.
Maybe. We've had some tough cases over the years, but
How do you think it is where they always say that when you're confronted by Jesus, you'll remember everything that you've done wrong?
yeah, they say
What about those things that you should have been murdered for, but you
Didn't
haven't, and you've forgotten about them?
that's why it's good at the end of a confession to say, and anything else that I can't remember, anything else I can't call to mind. It's good pious practice to try to bring everything to the table if possible. But see, God knows your sins. He wants you to be sorry for them, and He'll usually take care of the rest. But you have to recite them to the best of your ability. Because it's like with any good therapy session, you have to say what's wrong first, and then you get the healing. So to make a sin mortal, 3 things are necessary: a grievous matter, sufficient reflection, and full consent of the will. So honestly, stealing the jar of pickled beets probably wouldn't be a mortal sin, because it's not particularly valuable. It's not a valuable painting. It's not a bar of gold. It's vegetables, which are great, but probably not mortal sin territory. There has to be sufficient reflection. You have to have had time to think about it. If you do something on accident or on the spur of a moment, you didn't think about it, it just happened, that can't necessarily be a mortal sin. It also requires the full consent of the will. If you were in a state of drunkenness or asleep, you don't have the full consent of the will. If someone does not have the mental capacity, even of a 7-year-old, they can't really enter into mortal sin. Venial sin is quite a bit more common. Venial sin is a slight offense against the law of God in matters of less importance, or in matters of great importance, it is an offense committed without sufficient reflection or full consent of the will. So if I did something very, very bad in a state of drunkenness, it might only be considered a venial sin, because one of those things was lacking. Now, this is not the same as how we define a moral evil. So a moral evil, those things are always evil no matter what the circumstance. Someone was killed, it was evil. Now, was that person killed because the other person was defending themselves? Or were they murdered because they were innocent? Those are not very different things. One is a sin, one is not. But they're both evil, because taking of a human life is always evil, even if there's a very good reason. 58. What are the effects of venial sin? The effects of venial sin are the lessening of the love of God in our heart, the making us less worthy of His help, and the weakening of the power to resist mortal sin. He's always there like a father who wants to, have a good relationship with you. But I'm sure if you've ever had a conversation with your father, you probably have something you regret saying to him. Anybody ever had that? Something you wish you hadn't have said? So think about that. Those are the sorts of venial sins. It probably didn't break the relationship or destroy the relationship, but it might have weakened it. And so God is always wanting us to restore that friendship. And finally, what are the chief sources of sin? Now, this is interesting because in the parish bulletins for the last few weeks have been running the lists of virtues and vices. I find it fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's got to be one of the most,
Hard.
it's one of the most boring things I've ever put together. I just take it off the internet from another Catholic priest website. But when I look at them, I just shake my head and think, that's what I do. And I didn't know it had a word attached to it. But the seven sources of the chief sources of sin are pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, sloth. They are commonly called capital sins. Many of these we don't even consider sins anymore. You know, this word pride is thrown around so often. Pride is something that you should only take in, you should only have pride in something if it really is worthy of pride. Because so often people are prideful in things that don't matter that much, or they're not that significant. Pride should be something that wells up in your heart without you even wanting it there. You know, to have, and oftentimes it can be, when we say that we have pride in our country, did I do anything about that? I didn't do much. I mean, that feeling of pride really comes from what so many other people have done, and so many other values that have been expressed. Covetousness. Anytime we see an ad on the TV or the internet, and that is trying to get us to buy something, that's an expression of covetousness. I want that thing. Even though I don't need it, I want that thing. You're getting into that realm. Lust. Do you think this might be a problem in our society today? This complete oversaturation of our society with sexuality and lustful feelings, the reduced even age, the sexuality. The big thing was the sexualizing minors for a long time. I remember all my moms who had their girls in dance class back in the decade ago, probably still now, were in constant fights with the teachers about what was an appropriate costume for the little girls to wear when they did their dance. Right? Any of you moms experience any of that? Betty?
My nieces, yeah.
Yeah, it's this constant fight.
Just even in cosmetics, cosmetics and the continual supplements.
Right, yeah. But this idea of turning the body itself into an object, that's really what lust does, is you divest the body from the person. It's a terrible thing. Anger, a lot of anger. Gluttony, all of us probably eat way too much. In America, you can't help but be a glutton. It's everywhere. Even then, people get into this gluttony of orthorexia. You know what orthorexia is? You probably know what anorexia is. Anorexia is eating no food at all. Orthorexia is only eating the right thing. So you start to put all these limits on your diet, like, I do this kind of diet, I do that kind of diet. I only eat food that looks like this, or food that came from here, food that came from there. And this orthorexia can be as bad as the other types. It's this control of food. Gluttony can be too little, too much. It's making this false god, and it's like I think was this Elijah or Isaiah that said they've made their god their bellies. It's one of my favorite lines. Envy, wanting what someone else has, and sloth. We're a very slothful society. All right, there's enough. There's my judgmentalism for the day. Any questions on those two topics? It's very interesting.
I just had a comment. I couldn't think of the dance situation, although my girls did dance, but we didn't into that. But wedding dresses.
Oh yeah, wedding dresses.
I have 4 girls, and they're all married. And when we went, shopping for wedding dresses, I mean, it's horrible. They don't give girls the choices. Many. I mean, you can. I had one of my girls went online and got a Victorian that had long sleeves, and it was so elegant. But you go to the average bridal, and it's all this fallen.
Very, very low cut.
Yeah, no straps. So
straps.
we had some straps, but it's just like And I have gone to weddings where you're almost scandalized that this bride is in church and she's half naked.
Psychologically, why do they do that?
I don't know.
Does anybody understand?
They think they're sexy, I think.
The bride should only be sexy for the husband. Why
But
is she?
they're showing, I had a friend just put on Facebook, don't these women have mirrors? Because she was at a wedding and she's like, oh my, she didn't put any pictures of what they were, but I just can imagine. She goes, don't they have mirrors and aren't they looking at what have they looked to see what they look like? I mean, don't you have can't you say something as a priest when you're marrying somebody that you would like them to be?
No, I always talk to the couples beforehand and say that it needs to be a Christian, respectful service, and we expect that the music and the decorum and all that is to be done in line with this. But then they show up, and I would say almost all my weddings have been pretty good. But when someone shows up on the wedding day with their dresses and their outfits and things, and they've already spent their $10,000 on these things, as a priest, do I really stand there and say, get out of my church? I don't know.
But when you look at what people wear every day, with the wedding dress that they're buying isn't out of.
Right.
Well, I get a little offended even seeing some people at Saturday Mass and stuff.
Yeah, especially in summertime. We get into that. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight.